Hello, I'm Bill Cox. Frank and I are here in the edit room where we produce the program that you're about to see. Today, our colleges and universities face one of the greatest challenges ever, curtailing the rise in campus racism.
That's right, Bill. Historically, institutions of higher learning have prided themselves in being forums for open-mindedness and the exchange of ideas. However, all too often, students of color find that the campus environment is one of hostility and intolerance.
This unfriendly atmosphere has been a major deterrent to post-secondary education for many students of color. With society's rapid shift in demographics, colleges and universities are realizing the urgency in dealing with this dilemma.
The questions become, what's causing all of this racism on our campuses? How are the faculty, the administrators, and the students fighting against racism? And exactly what is being done to foster an atmosphere of cultural diversity and sensitivity?
During the course of this program, we will explore the issues surrounding campus racism in a manner never before witnessed. The conversation will be candid, they will be frank, and they will be honest. You will be challenged about your beliefs, your attitudes, and behavior. What's at stake in the outcome of these discussions are the future of many of the best minds in America and their institutions of higher learning.
Your participation bears witness to our belief that the resolution to the curse of racism in American higher education will soon be forthcoming. We thank you for joining us for today's program.
I feel uncomfortable.
There are a lot of problems.
This is our campus. You just happen to be here.
There's some real popular stereotypes.
There's pain.
There has been an increasing sense of racial tensions. Sometimes I am scared.
This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance.
There's no way that the college campus can be spared.
Racism. The very mention of the term evokes some of the most extreme reactions known to humankind. Bringing on pain, anger, resentment, and confusion, racism has been called one of the most destructive forces on the face of the earth. Hello, I'm Julian Bond. Today you will see and hear people who, like yourselves, are struggling with campus racism and all of its ramifications. You will have the opportunity to express your views and share in the discussion with our panel of experts by calling our toll-free number, 1-800-344-2388. Joining us in the studio, we have Reg Clark, Professor of Afro-Ethnic Studies from California State University, Fullerton. Susan Weidman Schneider, Editor-in-Chief of Lilith, an independent Jewish women's magazine. Dr. Naeem Akbar, a psychologist and educator from Florida State University. Mary Ellen Ashley, Vice Provost at the University of Cincinnati, and the author of Combating Racism on Campus. Michael Williams, Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the United States Department of Education. Richard Rubenstein, the Director of the Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Jawanza Kunjufu, author of Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. Lillian Roybal Rose, a workshop counselor, consultant, and educator in cross-cultural communication. Howard Ehrlich, Director of Research for the National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence in Baltimore, Maryland. And Ray Davis, Executive Director of Washington, D.C.'s Student Coalition Against Apartheid and Racism. Thank you all for being here. It's hard to believe, but today over 25%, that is 1 out of every 4 minority college students in America, cannot get through an academic year without experiencing a racially motivated incident. The incidents present themselves in a variety of fashions. Let's begin by taking a look at one, which occurred recently on the campus of George Washington University, located in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. George Washington is a predominantly white university in a cosmopolitan city that has a majority black population. The students on the campus are considered to be liberal and highly intelligent, with an entering SAT average of above 1,100. The student body includes a large number of international and Jewish students and a representative number of black students.
There has been an increasing sense of racial tensions. Sometimes I am scared.
This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance.
There's no way that the college campus can be spared.
Black men felt victimized by the graphic description of the assailants. There was a lot of pain because each of us identified in some way as being a potential suspect.
George Washington University's campus newspaper, the GW Hatchet, ran this story last December. A 19-year-old GW student was assaulted and repeatedly raped at knife point. The article further went on to say, according to GW sophomore Miriam Kashani, a private rape counselor who met the victim through a friend at the D.C. Rape Crisis Center, the two assailants were muscular, young-looking black males. Both were 6 foot and wearing dirty, torn clothing. She also noted they had particularly bad body odor. According to the Hatchet, after the rape, the two men laughed and said, "You were pretty good for a white girl."
As a black man, I felt offended, first off, and I've spoken with many other black males here on campus. And immediately we noticed that if we were walking around campus, we were glared at a certain way. I guess to let people were letting us know that I'm watching out for you, you're a threat to my well-being.
Soon after the article was published, it was discovered that the story was a lie, a hoax. The discovery of the falsity of the incident had a profound effect on the GW campus community. One of the most devastating realities brought out by the incident was the use of stereotyping about blacks, which is still very much alive.
She described the phantom rapists as smelly black men, and at the end of the incident saying that you were pretty good for a white girl, to lend some type of credibility to her false incident.
Before it was known that it was a hoax, we overheard white men on campus saying, a woman was stranger raped. Well, was she raped by black men? Yeah, of course. And, oh, I bet, well, it's great, he got some, or I bet he liked it, or something like that. So it just reinforced all those images of rape and all the racism.
But who was to blame for the far-reaching racist implications that surfaced from the incident? At the head of the structure is the institution of higher education, the university. Ultimately, the system failed.
Since the story published in the paper was wrong, turned out to be fraudulent, it's clear that the paper didn't do everything that could have been done. There's undoubtedly some additional step that had they taken, they would have found out the truth and they wouldn't have published the story. But the question is one of how far do you have to go?
Hatchet reporters still defend their actions.
Basically everything was followed up on. It was just that we had someone impersonating a police officer over the phone, and it just so happened that the name that they used to impersonate with, when we called district police to confirm that such an officer existed, there was such an officer. And so it sort of was very coincidental or pre-thought out, I don't know.
I was surprised when the Hatchet printed the story on Thursday morning. I was in contact with reporters as late as 8:30 Wednesday evening and still was unable to confirm the facts of the story. And so I found it surprising that it was printed the following morning.
Many GW faculty are not surprised by this kind of incident on this campus or any others across the country.
The rise of racism is simply a reflection of what's going on in the society at large. And one is surprised to see that racism is so rampant on the college campus. However, if you recognize that the society itself is shot through with pernicious racism, you should at the same time recognize that there's no way that the college campus can be spared.
Joining us live by telephone is Dr. Stephen Trachtenberg, president of George Washington University. Dr. Trachtenberg, thank you for being with us today.
Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The incident we just saw raises a plethora of issues, among them free speech, the role of the campus press, and the willingness of the white community to accept stereotypes. I want to remind our viewers that we'll be taking your telephone calls now, so please call 1-800-344-2388. While we're waiting for telephone calls, let's go to our studio audience for their questions. Let me begin here. Can you stand up, please? What kind of effect does an incident like this have on a college campus?
Well, the primary effect that it has is it raises or brings to light our fears of living in a city, and you have a tendency to believe that because you're on a college campus that you are safe from the world around you, but it kind of reminds you that you are in the center of a city and there is a dangerous element out there. It brings to light the questions or concerns about racism that not all of us face daily. And I think it's an opportunity, or hopefully can become an opportunity for us to learn more about what different elements of the student population feel.
Thank you. We have a special guest here in the studio. It's Jeffrey Stewart, professor of history at George Mason University. He's an expert in race relations in the country and on the history of race. Dr. Stewart, what is it that's so deeply ingrained in the American social fabric that this girl would know that this lie would work?
The appeal of the story really comes from the power of the stereotype of the black rapist. And that stereotype has a long history in American culture. It was used in the 1890s, for example, to justify lynching, segregation, and voter terrorism against black population. So I think that's one of the frightful things about it, is that a stereotype like this can be used to incite violence. It's also a stereotype that was used more recently by President Bush in his campaign with the image of Willie Horton. And in that case, it was used for political advantage. So I think that it's a image that has a strong residue in our culture and which can be tapped into very easily. I think one of the really tragedies of this situation is that it was essentially misrepresentative. Most rapes on a white campus are basically perpetrated by whites. We know, for example, that most rapes today are date rapes. So in this attempt to kind of inform or politicize the community, this rape counselor has actually misinformed her community.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Dr. Kunjufu, let me go to you. Psychologically, what impact does an incident like this one have on black male students on a college campus?
Well, it's unfortunate. One of the books that we've produced, titled The Mugging of Black America, pointed out that crime is primarily perpetuated among people that not only know each other, but within the same race. And of course, this situation sort of contradicted that particular statistic. The major concern, though, is that in our society, whether it's black men trying to find a taxi driver to go somewhere, trying to matriculate through college in terms of graduation, the images are maintained, which is why we decided to produce a movie titled Up Against the Wall. And in the movie that Oprah Winfrey produced, Women of Brewster Place, there were 8 positive women and not 1 positive black man. We asked Oprah to clean it up in the TV series. She put in 3 positive black men. One of them was a single father, raising his children by himself, and the TV series is no longer on. We believe images are very important, and the newspaper reinforced a negative image that we have to correct.
Susan Weidman Schneider, what does this say about the conjunction of race and sex in our society? What does this issue say?
Well, it's interesting. I think very clearly racism and sexism are linked, and very tightly linked in many instances. People are, in some respects, I think, equal opportunity haters, unfortunately. What we see in this particular incident from GW University is that there is a confluence of forces at work. It seems to me quite absurd in a society where women have been victimized aplenty, that there's no need to create fiction. There's enough real-life rape. But the usefulness of something that attacks women and can be dredged up to incite hatred against blacks, it seems to me, is a very potent example of that kind of fungibility, the crossover of the gender and sexist issues, and with racism.
Mr. Davis, let me go to you. You're the student in this gathering. What does this do to a college student when the allegation is made, true or not, that a member of the group has been guilty of some horrendous crime? What effect does that have on the other members of the group?
I think it's one of the most difficult situations that a student of color or an African-American student can face on a campus like this. All of the stereotypes, all of the problems that we face in terms of us not being considered worthy to be on many predominantly white campuses, all of that is manifest in a situation like this and just increases the social hostility that a lot of students face.
And Mr. Ehrlich, your organization collects examples of this kind of campus-based charge and real allegation. Are these common? Are these frequent, these kinds of false charges?
The false charges are themselves not terribly frequent, but the lesson, it seems to me, of this incident is the lesson of the generality of prejudice, and it's an important lesson to keep in mind, namely that people who are prejudiced towards one group tend to be prejudiced towards others. And the key element of that lesson is one for organizers to understand that if we fight, for example, sexism, we are also fighting racism. If we fight anti-Semitism, we're also fighting anti-Latino feelings and the like. I think that's one of the most critical lessons of this. The other lesson is the role of the media in communicating ethno-violence and setting the agenda for us.
Mr. Kunjufu, you want to jump in?
I just wanted to mention that, to put this in a larger context, 80% of the crime committed in America is white-collar crime. And just recently, a white stockbroker embezzled about $13 million and was fined $5,500. A black unemployed man stole a television set and was sentenced for 6 years. This whole concept of a corporal punishment or capital punishment simply means that you have capital, you are not punished.
Mr. Williams, early in your career, you were in charge of prosecuting racist terror incidents, against racist terror incidents. Is this kind of thing an example of racist terror? Should there be some prosecution, not in this instance, let's say, but generally when these kind of charges are made and aren't true?
Well, generally under the federal criminal civil rights statutes, there is a requirement under federal law that there be some kind of act of violence. And so an incident of that would not be the kind of conduct that would rise to the level of being the kind that would be prescribed by federal criminal civil rights law. But that is not to say that the conduct that was exhibited there is not the kind that should be sanctioned in some kind of way and should not be called to have attention called to by university officials. I am interested in what Professor Ehrlich said about the lessons that we learned from this. And I think one of the additional lessons is that when we're dealing in the area of race, obviously there is a great deal of volatility. And one of the lessons is the responsibility of the media. And in addition to that, the responsibility of university officials when incidents occur on their campuses.
Thank you. We've got a question on the line. This is line number 1 from Abraham Baldwin College in Georgia. Go ahead.
Okay, this is James Burroughs from Abraham Baldwin. Question is that it seems as though the administration of many colleges and universities refuse to address the racial problems on their campuses. And the question is, what can higher education do to address and or eliminate the problems faced by the students who are in the racial minority on these campuses that refuse or are reluctant to admit that they have a problem?
Dr. Trachtenberg, you're still with us. What can an institution do? What should an institution do in an incident like this?
Well, my mother used to say that whatever didn't kill you made you stronger. And I think George Washington University is surely a stronger institution because of this incident, as painful as it was to everybody involved, and particularly to the young male blacks on campus. I believe the institution has come together and has taken a look at racism on the campus in a more open-eyed and candid way than would have happened otherwise. I think we've looked at women's issues and the issue of rape more openly. We are taking a hard look at the student newspaper and who it reports to. So, for example, there have been people who've held the university accountable for the behavior of the student newspaper, whereas the student newspaper sees itself as accountable essentially to the First Amendment of the Constitution and does not invite the administration of the university in. People write to the president of the university and say, fire the president of the student newspaper. In fact, the university does not elect or appoint the leadership of the student newspaper. That's done by students. And what we have, and to some extent, in the newspaper race issue is a clash of two positive things, a free press and a concern on the part of that press to have a sensitivity to the fact that you have a multicultural campus, and the need for the press, even a student press, to behave in a professional manner. These aren't simple issues, but I think at George Washington University, we're dealing with them in a way that we would not have but for this incident.
Why is that so, Dr. Trachtenberg? Why does it take an incident like this to galvanize a campus into action and some response?
Because there's no end of issues that are coming at us in all directions, whether it's wrestling with the federal government over financial aid or trying to balance the budget or deal with tuition matters or one thing or another. And inevitably, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. You've only got 24 hours to your day, 7 days a week, and we are, for better or worse, as human beings, responsive to crisis. That's too bad, and obviously we try to be rational and we try to plan and we try to get ahead of issues so that we are not merely crisis responsive. But I think even in our private lives, all of us don't replace the watch until it breaks, it's just a human nature, I think.
Dr. Ishii, let me come to you. One of the things Dr. Trachtenberg raises and has been raised time and again in these incidents is the conflict between free speech and other values that we cherish just as deeply. What ought to happen to a university newspaper, or what ought the policy be in an incident like this?
Well, I don't know that I can answer what the policy ought to be. I think what he's expressing is the fact that most institutions are very comfortable with remaining pretty distant from these issues. And I suspect...
I don't think so. That's not what I'm expressing at all.
Well,
I'm not comfortable with it at all. But I don't think it's a simple issue. And I think if the president of the university reaches his hand into the situation and dismisses the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, what you get is a major league First Amendment issue in which the American Civil Liberties Union and a whole variety of other people who are very keen to keep an eye on civil rights and very keen to keep an eye on First Amendment rights on university campuses change the agenda.
Dr. Ishii, Dr. Trachtenberg, let me take this out of the specific case. In a general sense, what ought we be looking at here?
I think you have to look, first of all, systemically throughout your institution, and you can't just take a look after an incident. You need to start to look over the entire institution, what you need to be doing, and that means that you probably need faculty talking about what they're doing with journalism students to sensitize them to how they responsibly and ethically report. You probably need a lot of training, and you take your press, your student press in particular, into sensitivity training so that they recognize when it might be responsible to wait for the facts before you report and raise a number of issues. And I don't think that that's antithetical to free speech. And I think it's a cop-out on the part of most higher education institutions to more or less hide behind free speech comfortably to not have to address these issues and confront them face on.
I don't think most universities are hiding behind this as a matter of free speech. I think it is possible to do all of the very constructive things that you're recommending and still have incidents where people screw up. And the question is, we live in an imperfect world. How do we continue to work together as people of goodwill towards constantly improving things without having to look for scapegoats and people to blame, because that doesn't achieve anything.
Thank you, Dr. Trachtenberg. We've got a call on the line from Cal State University at Fullerton. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, this is Robbie Nyman from California State University at Fullerton. I'm wondering if the panel would comment on the role the university administration should play in supporting academic freedom on the one hand, and yet sending a strong, unequivocal message of support for standards of behavior on campus that support and affirm cultural diversity.
I'd like to jump in. I think it's very important that we not focus exclusively, in fact, on the press, that within constitutional guidelines, and certainly these can be worked out with the teams of institutional lawyers that exist on many campuses today, it's very important for us to set up a variety, if you will, of an honor code where it's very clear to students what is and is not acceptable behavior. It is certainly not acceptable behavior for the rape counselor at GW to have invented a story in order to make her point. It has to be made very clear both to students and to faculty and to all the ancillary personnel that there are acceptable and unacceptable forms of behavior, even while working towards social change, that even with the best of goals, the means you use to arrive at those goals have to be honorable ones.
Yeah, I would just point out as a matter of factual correction, this woman was not a rape counselor at George Washington University. She was a self-designated rape counselor. She's self-appointed. She credentialed herself. She didn't work for the university in any way whatsoever. She was merely a sophomore undergraduate.
Thank you again, Dr. Trachtenberg. Yes, Mr. Davis.
I just would like to respond to those comments by Dr. Trachtenberg. I think, first of all the issues he brought up, the most important aspect of any university is the students themselves. And if we forget the students and we neglect the students, then we're going to have problems on the university. A specific response to the earlier students' question would be that in terms of what do you do, I think you need to keep pushing on these issues of diversity, change of curriculum, cultural centers, etc. A lot of institutions are not going to move on their own. You also would do well to find faculty allies if you can. There are faculty that will support and help you in these things. So what you need is a conjunction of students, faculty, and staff to push for these issues.
Well, we want to thank George Washington President Dr. Stephen Trachtenberg for being with us. Yes, Ms. Roybal, do you have Ms. Rose, rather?
I want to reiterate that there's a quality of difference between something that is proactive and something that is reactive. When we're talking about lessons learned, that if the universities would take a proactive stance in setting the training, setting the frameworks with which to understand differences and when differences break down, that the lesson learned from that is much better than anything that is reactive. And I think that talking about if it doesn't kill you, there has to be a lesson of it. I don't think that statistically that would pan out, that this kind of thing is injurious to us. It's injurious to people of color, and that we end up internalizing a lot of that anger and rage and frustration. And I don't see anything learned from it unless it is from a proactive frame of reference.
Mr. Rubenstein, you wanted to jump in on this a moment ago.
I think that the point is, just agreeing with that comment, that especially we who are supposed to be scholars ought to know when incidents, so-called, are predictable. Incidents and specific disputes are predictable when there is conflict. There is conflict on every campus in which there are diverse groups. Whether the conflict is presently breaking forth in the form of incidents like this or not, the conflict is there, the incidents will break out, and the problem is how to deal with all of the parties, how to bring them into contact with each other and into dialogue, and how to start working on the causes of the conflict before the incidents happen. Because once the incident takes place, as Dr. Trachtenberg's comments reflect, there's a tendency to fixate on the incident itself and to try to develop means of controlling the damage. This kind of crisis management is exactly what we can't afford in dealing with racism either on or off the campus.
Now, one of the hot issues on college campuses has been what an earlier caller raised, this question of balancing First Amendment rights with these other values that we have. How do we deal with this? Dr. Ashley, you touched on it very quickly. How do you balance these things? Any member of the panel? Dr. Ashley?
Well, I think that the whole issue of academic freedom is another one of those issues that people tend to hide behind to not deal with the reality of what's there. There are clear standards for performance in any kind of setting, be it an educational organization, a business organization, a governmental organization. It does not seem to me to be inconsistent with the mission of any university setting to have very clear standards about what is in fact ethically possible and impossible without infringing upon one's academic rights. And I think certainly to misrepresent the truth, to misrepresent reality, to systematically present biased issues of what's real and what's not real is not an issue of academic freedom, it's an issue of falsity and deception. So I think that as a standard that the top administrators must take, that certain things are not going to be tolerated in this environment simply because this is an environment that is reflective of certain kinds of moral and human values which transcend those particular legal rights that you may claim for yourself.
There's no question about that, but at the university...
that comment wasn't related to you anyway. It was responding to the question of academic freedom.
I understand, and I think what you say is sound.
Dr. Trachtenberg, thank you a great deal. Dr. Akbar, thank you a great deal.
Implementing that philosophy, I think, is the question.
We're sorry, we've got to move on. Another form of racism, not as overt but equally serious and more difficult to rectify, is institutional racism. In order to better understand this concept, we visited the oldest and most prestigious university in the United States, Harvard University. While Harvard has experienced relatively few overt incidents, an examination of its procedures and traditions exemplify how racism can sometimes be found in what would ordinarily be considered race-neutral practices.
There has been an increasing sense of racial tensions. Sometimes I am scared.
This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance.
There's no way that the college campus can be spared.
Harvard's very old. It's, of course, the oldest college in the country. And with that comes a lot of conservatism, and it takes it a while to change.
When traditions are used to maintain practices that are exclusionary, whether they're exclusionary based on race, or religion, or prior economic condition, what have you, they are harmful.
Tradition is an integral part of the Harvard experience. However, some believe that Harvard's traditional approach to education is not keeping up with our changing multiracial society.
These students have been conditioned. I really think that it would be worth our while to require post-World War II history. It would do much more than just teach the history. It would condition them to what's going on in our society. We are truly a multiracial society, and will become more so.
We really aren't as progressive as we'd like to think we are. Although you may not be affected personally by an overt act of racism, there's a lot of things happening on subtle levels, and I wish people would just keep their eyes open.
In higher education, the competition for what curricula will be taught has traditionally been a point of contention. At Harvard, many say that not enough emphasis has been placed on the Afro-American Studies department. Last year, the already small and fragile department was devastated when its chairman died, and 2 of its junior faculty left for other schools. The administration's slowness to respond to the needs of the Afro-American Studies department has elicited a strong reaction from some students. Last fall, a sit-in was held at the administration building. Critics considered this tactic extreme.
Most of them are militants, yeah. That is, that they take a view that America is essentially a racist society, and that there is no way to cure this except with some kind of radical restructuring or even revolution.
And the fact that your history is not being discussed, your experience is not being dealt with, can only elicit anger and frustration. We're trying to channel that anger and frustration into more productive means by, fighting for an Afro-American Studies department.
Another area of concern is the lack of minority faculty. Harvard currently has only 2 tenured faculty members of color at the undergraduate level.
Harvard is having a problem recruiting younger people because I think most people now would rather go to a good state institution where they are assured of tenure, or at least have a much better chance of getting tenure, than to experience the glory of being at Harvard for 5 or 6 years and then suddenly find themselves without a job.
Part of what happened was that minority students who went to college and to professional school in the last decade or so often chose to go to law school or to medical school or to business school rather than into academic training, rather than to seek the PhD.
Those who advocate a strong Afro-American Studies department and a greater number of minority faculty are looking for signs of leadership from the administration. Most are disappointed with what they have seen.
I feel like an institution like Harvard, that's supposed to be on the cutting edge of education, and that is world known for its excellence in faculty and in teaching, could do better.
Many universities and colleges take their cues from Harvard on a lot of things. And so if Harvard provided leadership in this area, I think that they could have an effect on universities and colleges around the country.
But others agree that changes have to be made if Harvard is to remain an academic leader as it enters the 21st century.
To think that we can continue on for the next 200 years as we have for the past 200 years is virtually, I think, suicidal. So that the society is going to have to reach out. It's going to have to encompass the full range of people within this country who call themselves America. Or after a while, a great number of them may not want to be called American any longer.
Recently, Harvard announced that the renowned black scholar, Henry Louis Gates, has accepted their offer to become the new chair of the Afro-American Studies Department. Some view this as a sign of Harvard's commitment to the department. It's hoped that Gates' appointment will attract minority faculty members to Harvard and revitalize Afro-American studies. Joining us live by telephone hookup are Howard University's Ron Quincy, who is the assistant to the president for faculty affirmative action, and Assistant Dean Hilda Hernandez-Gravel, the Director of the Office of Race Relations and Minority Affairs. Thanks, both of you, for joining us today. Sorry. I want to remind our viewing audience that we'll be taking your calls on institutional racism, so please call in with your questions and comments to 1-800-344-2388. While we're waiting for your calls, let me put a question to our guest from Harvard. Why should a university have an Afro-American Studies department?
Well, it's important for any major university to recognize the accomplishments of African Americans in scholarship, and it's important that we support the Homeless Possible program for the purposes of, as I said, of scholarship as well as purposes of our students. We have a very diverse student population, and we owe it to them to provide them with the and most diverse educational experience they can possibly have.
Dr. Clark, let me come to you. Why couldn't these courses be simply part of the regular curriculum? Why couldn't white teachers teach these colleges? Why are minority faculty that important?
Well, the problem there is that white teachers, like most of white society, are victims of the same stereotypes for the most part as the rest of the society. The fact of the matter is they perceive those courses as somehow superfluous to the needs of students, and yet there is now some movement afoot to enter into some type of multicultural, gender fair kind of course offerings. However, even in those contexts where that's being done, what you often find is a general suspicion among white faculty about what is being provided, what type of information, what types of ideologies. And again, we get back to the academic freedom issue here. The reality is that these courses are perceived as best left off in a corner somewhere, away from the mainstream or main line of the university's offerings, precisely because as those other professors have learned their particular disciplines, they have not learned how to integrate multicultural orientations into their offerings.
Mr. Kanjufu?
I just want to add to reinforce Dr. Clark's comments. We need to make sure we understand that this discussion that we're having on the issue of racism and how it cannot be separated from curriculum, from faculty percentages, from economics and the rest. Remember the word, Jillian, history is nothing but his story. And Harvard University, the oldest university, still claims that Columbus discovered America, that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and that Greece is the origin of civilization. Now, there's a lot of research out there that they have access to that refutes all of those statements, that Columbus was lost and the Native Americans discovered him, that Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free anybody, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. But how can you tell the people, Jillian, that they're inferior and then acknowledge that civilization started in Egypt, and at Harvard University, they have taken Egypt out of Africa and placed it in the Middle East? Now I don't know how you can do that. So that at Harvard, all the students are taught that Hippocrates was the first doctor, when in actuality, the first doctor was Imhotep. And in the state of Massachusetts, if you want to be a doctor, you will still take the Hippocratic Oath. And Hippocrates pointed out the first doctor's name was Aesculapius, his Greek name, and his African name was Imhotep.
Let's get a response from the representative from Harvard University.
Well, clearly we want to assure there is not only diversity on the faculty, but also want to make sure that issues of scholarship are handled by those who are capable of presenting the correct history. As the professor indicated, there obviously are many discrepancies in the scholarship that prior the ability of faculty in major university campuses. Obviously, with faculty, we're able to have those distortions muted and those distortions presented in their history right. So I don't have any disagreement with.
Dr. Akbar, we had a little trouble with the transmission on the line. I think if I can, he's trying to get some balance between disputed scholarship and actual scholarship. Speak to that, if you will. And at the same time, Ought these kinds of courses be required or mandatory for every student at a campus? Ought it be set aside in a major? Ought it be directed just at the minorities? What's the role of these kinds of programs on a college campus?
Let me address both of those. First of all, this whole question about disputed scholarship, all scholarship is disputed. It just simply means as a way of perpetuating the kind of racist conceptions of African reality that are already in the system. Those things which are disputed from the Afrocentric point of view are more disputed than ordinary disputation. And I think that the problem is that when Harvard has as its logo, as do most universities, Veritas, which means truth, there seems to be a real lack of commitment to truth, but a commitment to preserving tradition in the status quo. I also believe that, to follow up on the other point, is that the whole issue of institutional racism preserves the tendency to perceive that there is a singular way to approach reality. And clearly the idea that African American studies must only service African American students, again perpetuates that myth that no one needs to know the black experience but black people. On the contrary, those who are most liking, who are actually those who are the greatest perpetrators of the crimes of racism, and that's European Americans. They are the ones who are the racists and preservers of the racist system, by virtue of the fact that they preserve, build, maintain the institutions that perpetuate racist reality. So I think that the whole issue then of how do we begin to break through that tradition which does not let white people understand what's true about people other than themselves.
We've got a call on the line from the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Go ahead, caller, you're on the line.
Yes, my name is Taria Schaefer, and my question is, why should we as students expect the universities to act on racism when the institution contributes to it by not educating the students' body about each other's true history?
Any member of the panel? Go ahead.
Well, I would like to suggest that one way of combating the ignorance about differences, which is at the root of a lot of the bias that we're speaking about, is not so much by keeping these course offerings separate or even optional and separate, but by mainstreaming them at the same time that there is a separate women's studies or Jewish studies or African American studies department, but that this material be incorporated into general humanities and social science courses. It's extraordinarily important, especially for people growing up in America who have tended to equate different with wrong.
Mary Ellen Ashley, let me go to you. You represent a university. If the university is guilty, can it help to solve the crime?
I certainly hope so. I think that our university is trying to do that and trying to make white students aware of the fact that they don't even know how they help to perpetuate racism. And I would fully support the fact that every one of them needs a number of courses in ethnic studies, not only African American studies, but I'd also like to address the other issue of why we need minority faculty. We think it's fine for us to promote diversity with students and to teach them what they need to know, and we treat ourselves very much as though we have no need to know anything else. And I think we need as much experience with a diverse faculty as our students need information about diversity.
Lillian Roybal Rose, you had a question?
Yes.
An answer, rather.
Right. From a sheer communication standpoint, in order to have true communication in its ideal sense, you have to have peerness. And what I'm seeing in universities is that they are having ethnic studies or women's studies as a checklist. But you can't have peerness unless you have that and teach it from the point of view of the group itself. And what happens oftentimes is that we'll have ethnic studies, but we'll have a white professor telling you what this black person thinks, and then they'll analyze it and tell you the real truth, rather than having validity and peerness with the point of view of the group itself. The other side of that is I still am confused because we continue to talk about scholars, and I can't understand how anyone who can have the title of scholar isn't outraged at the fact that they only have partial knowledge. And I think when we can shift that frame of reference, when white professors can shift the frame of reference and start looking toward ethnic studies, not for people of color or women's studies for women and whatever, but to look at it for themselves, because they can no longer be ignorant of the whole picture. That when they're doing it for themselves, that the shift will be significant, and they'll be doing it for all the right reasons without the condescension and patronization that comes in when someone says, I'm doing this for you.
Professor Clark, let me put a question in a larger context. When does academic elitism become racism? When does a university that says these fields of study, Afro-American studies, don't meet our standards, when does that become not just critical judgment, but racism, in fact?
Well, it becomes racism as soon as the university presumes that precisely because they are different, they are inferior. Precisely because they have to do with a culture other than the Eurocentric culture, that somehow they do not deserve a place in the curriculum, or they deserve an inferior place in the curriculum. I would like to observe that as students who come to these courses are introduced to this new knowledge, most often they go away saying, why is it that nobody ever shared with me this knowledge? Why is it that it took getting to a college environment before I was able to learn, for example, that Columbus not only did not discover America, but slaughtered the Indians in the process of getting here? And why is it that all of the history and the so-called realities we have been told were in fact skewed to fit another kind of perspective? The other point I'd like to make is that I see this as part of a larger framework of how the university system has dealt with its non-white professors historically. There is a long and shameful history of obliterating and indeed of maiming black and other minority professors under the guise that they weren't qualified, etc., such that now most of the professors in the last 15, 20 years who have come through the system have been knocked down and have found themselves going on to other careers and doing other kinds of things in administration or something else, because it is the recalcitrance and the resistance of the predominantly white male faculties that have yet to come to terms with the reality that these people have something meaningful to contribute on an equal level.
We've got a call on the line from Eastern Michigan University. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, this is to the statement that Mr. Kunjufu made. Since blacks have gotten this negative image on campus, how can we get some positive suggestions to get rid of that stereotype in the media? And with that negative black stereotype, how can another black male stop minority funding? Because that's an important issue, that minorities don't have enough money for unmet student needs now, and that needs to be addressed, and it hasn't.
Mr. Kunjufu, the question addressed to you.
I didn't quite understand the last statement about minority funding.
Asking about Mr. Williams' ruling in the Department of Education about minority scholarships, but speak to the first part of the question if you could
speak
first.
To the first part. Because that's another issue. Maybe later on we'll get a chance to discuss it. But on the issue we're looking at with regards to images and tying it to curriculum, I just want to make sure this concept called multicultural education and the melting pot theory, we need to juxtapose a melting pot theory to a salad bowl. And in a multicultural curriculum, you have the event in the middle, not white people. You no longer see the world through white eyes. You put the event in the middle, and you go around the world, and you see what everyone says about the same event. The Asians, the Africans, the Europeans, the Hispanics, the Native Americans, and you'll ask them, did Columbus discover America? The views on the Civil War, those kinds of issues. And in this way, when we discuss Lincoln, we can discuss Lincoln and Frederick Douglass simultaneously, and we'll have a lot of different views about the same event. And that's what makes it multicultural. I want to quickly also mention that unfortunately most schools teach Negro history, not African history. There's an historical law that says when you start will determine where you end up. If you start a people in 1619, you start them on a plantation, they'll end up in a ghetto. If you start them 4 million years ago, they start on a pyramid, they'll end up being free. So most Negro history classes go like this. First day, we're in Africa, but only for a day. Second day on the boat, already ready to come to America. And the rest is, of course, slaves in America. I've often wondered why the Jews are not embarrassed discussing the Holocaust, but many of our people are embarrassed discussing slavery. I think it goes back to the law. And at some point, Julian, we have to look at the real issue. And that's that a good Black Studies program does more than study us. It also studies the oppressor. Why are some people insecure? Because remember, racism is a sign of insecurity. People that are secure are comfortable with differences. Only insecure people would have to rationalize because they're different. It makes them better.
Thank you for those comments. On this subject, like so many others, there's a whole lot we could say. In light of the constant physical and psychological attacks, minority students have resorted to various coping strategies. Separation along racial lines is a commonly found phenomenon on campuses around the country, including the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill is considered to be one of the South's best and most liberal universities. Like most universities in the South, Black students weren't admitted until the 50s and the 1960s. Today, UNC's student body is 9% Black. Separatism such as that found at Chapel Hill is one of the most perplexing and agonizing issues on today's college campuses.
There has been an increasing sense of racial tensions. Sometimes I am scared.
This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance.
There's no way that the college campus can be spared.
Everyone wants to create their little separate Black college within the white university instead of disseminating their culture and learning about other cultures.
You can go 4 years here at the University of North Carolina without ever having made a friend of another race.
Racial separatism is not a new concept at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but recent overt racial incidents have reinforced the self-imposed segregation on this campus. Many Black students feel that the administration and their fellow students are sending them a strong message.
There's a general attitude on this campus of, this is our campus and you just happen to be here.
What I've heard is that some African American students are considering transferring because they feel that the tension will reach so high that something violent will occur.
I'm the homecoming queen, the 1990 homecoming queen, and I was the one who on election day for the homecoming queen received a note under my car windshield wiper saying, quote, UNC will not have another nigger queen.
In addition, some Black students feel that the university president has done little to speak out against racially motivated incidents.
I would really like to know his feelings towards prejudice and racism on this campus. He's been strangely silent.
When someone commits a thoughtless racist act, as was done in that case, it diminishes our enjoyment of what ought to be celebrated, and that is that for 2 years in a row in a popular election, we did elect African American homecoming queens. And that small victory is lost in our disappointment, in our fury that someone blew it.
We're kind of searching for a needle in a haystack in a lot of cases. It only takes one person to do a lot of damage to the racial balance on campus.
When you know that people have reached a level where they feel free to act out those racial tensions, and moreover, they know that the administration's response will simply be that those are isolated incidences, we're going to try to find the culprits, which they never do, you start to feel scared. This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance. I think it's completely unfair that minority students, African American students in particular, have to go to school wondering about whether or not they're going to get attacked.
Another test for university administrators was the removal of a group of statues called the student body that were in front of the campus library. Black students were uncomfortable with the statues, feeling they reinforce negative stereotypes. This issue became a topic of hot controversy on campus.
We saw the white students on the campus coming out and saying, hey, this is going too far. This is too much. Those statues aren't racist. I still was, really excited to hear that because finally they were being honest in how they felt, and not shirking away from the argument, not walking around the corner. Finally, not being afraid of being called a racist.
If more people were willing to communicate honestly, if whites were willing to communicate their views, however progressive or backward they may be, and blacks were willing to do the same, communicate their views no matter how progressive or backward, then possibly we could get to the point where if we can't agree to agree, then at least we can agree to disagree and move on.
There were people in honest anguish about whether even to move those statues would constitute censorship. I was one who had to get over that hurdle because I'm almost an absolutist in terms of artistic expression, freedom of speech, and the like. I finally decided that people were hurting, and that in addition to our concern for artistic expression, we had to be concerned when people are hurting. And if we could relieve that hurt without doing violence to our principles of artistic freedom, we should do it.
One of the most obvious outcomes of the climate on campus is a strong separatism between the black and white student body. It is a known fact that the majority of the black population lives on South Campus by choice.
I love hanging around African Americans just by virtue of our culture, by who we are, and because I feel very comfortable around them, particularly in this type of society. And I wouldn't view it as racist or separatist. People, you hang with whoever you feel comfortable with. That's who you associate with, and there's nothing wrong with that.
There is a certain pressure to be seen with black students just because, there's always that feeling that, well, if so-and-so doesn't hang out with black students, well, so-and-so is gray or, isn't really down with the black students or whatever.
The only experience that students seem to have that is in common is the classroom experience. That when we leave the classroom, many of the other programs are really voluntary and require some degree of initiative and self-awareness for a student to even bring themselves to a discussion, for instance, on black-white relations.
Joining us live by telephone from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is Dr. Harold Wallace, Vice Chancellor for University Affairs. Dr. Wallace, thanks for being with us today.
Pleased to join.
I want to remind our viewing audience that this is your chance to call in with questions on separatism. Please call 1-800-344-2388. While we're waiting for some questions, let's find out what the studio audience feels about this. We've got some students here in the last row. What do you feel about this kind of separatism and voluntary segregation you see on the college campus today?
First of all, at Georgetown University, it's pretty conspicuous in the school cafeteria where you see students, let's say all black students tend to congregate together, and white students do the same thing at other tables. But a lot of black students are saying that white students come to them and say, why is it that the black students don't want to mix with us, assuming that the blacks should take the initiative to go out there while they shouldn't do it. And I think it should be on, both sets of students should take the initiative to go and try to mix with each other and see if you can learn anything about, different cultures and so forth.
What's wrong with these students separating themselves as long as nobody's telling them to do it?
Well, both students may remain ignorant of certain issues that can benefit them both. I know personally, one time I went to a dormitory and it was at night, and so the doors were locked and my ID wouldn't work in the ID slot, and so the white students would not open the door for me. They assumed that since I'm from D.C. and they figured I'm from D.C. and I'm black, therefore I must be a mugger or something, so they didn't open the door for me. And I guess if we tend to get together more often, I guess we can learn a lot more about each other, and maybe we'll get rid of some stereotypes and so forth.
Okay, thank you. We've got a call on the line. Caller, go ahead. Tell us where you're from and what your question is.
Hello, this is Marie Draper Dykes from Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Please comment on the pros and cons of establishing a central office for minority affairs versus decentralizing the responsibility and integrating it into the general academic organization.
Mr. Williams, that seems just right for you.
Harold Wallace at Chapel Hill.
Unity on a campus, as we were talking about Afrocentric education, multiculturalism, I think what we're trying to approach here is to create a community. And when we have a situation that is a separate minority affairs part of the campus, it sends the message, I think, sometimes unfortunately, to a large segment of that campus that we're placing those issues, those interests, and those people and their concerns afar on another side of the campus. I think what we would prefer to do, if we're trying to create a climate, if we're trying to create a community, is to bring those needs, those interests, and those concerns within another part of the unit. Of the university, and thereby deal with them in that fashion, as opposed to segregating them or ghettoizing them off on another part of the campus.
Mary Ellen Ashley, do you have a point of view?
Yes, I'd like to say I think we can do both. And I think on large, predominantly white institutions, what we've really got to do is give minority students a focal place, a place where they can find people like themselves and they know they can find them there. And then we can also work on making all of our other offices and services invitational to people of all races and other kinds of differences. The point is, it's not just one or the other, and most predominantly white institutions aren't ready yet to say just go for mainstreaming. They've got a lot of work to do before we're ready to do that.
Dr. Akbar?
I guess one of the concerns I have with both the separatism issue and the reverse racism argument you often hear is a failure to appreciate the historical context for our behavior. That is that one needs an antidote often to correct a deadly poison. Having come through a society that has systematically told you that you are not worth anything, having a curriculum that never reflects your reality, dealing with a world that is constantly degrading you and putting you into a negative light, often being isolated in a university setting where you don't see anyone like you sometimes for weeks at a time, one must choose certain kinds of decisions based upon one's own survival. And certainly the source of support, which comes from people like yourself, is a means of doing that. That's not the same as legalized segregation. That's not the same as not being permitted to interact if you choose to interact. That doesn't create barriers that says it is legally unacceptable for you to come into this room, to sit down at this table. That's a choice of selections that are made based upon the need to survive in an ordinarily hostile environment that must be viewed as an antidote to a very sick environment, and people like to focus on the reverse antidote rather than deal with the original poison.
Thank you. Mr. Ehrlich. Mr. Ehrlich, in the kinds of incidences of violence that you monitor, how much does this charge of separatism or voluntary apartheid, how much does this play in the tension we see on college campuses?
Well, the differential perception of black and white plays a major part in the incidents. And what we've seen in the North Carolina film clip really is a very clear difference in the experience and perceptions of black and white. And it leads me to raise the question both about the North Carolina case and about the Harvard case, and listening to the comments of some of the panelists, is that we're not raising the issue of what is it a college education ought to be, and granting the need for separatism for survival and security. Is that not a failure at North Carolina or elsewhere in terms of what we want a college education to be, in terms of what kinds of experiences we want all students to have? And that I think we need to focus really on what happens to that incoming student, what they get exposed to, because that determines what their career is going to be for the next 4 years.
A caller on the line from Springfield College wants to ask a question about this question. Go ahead. Caller, you're on the air.
Hi, I'm calling from Massachusetts. Basically, I'd like your opinion on whether or not you believe implementing multicultural education in the college or institutional level is too late, and what is it that we can do to put this into our secondary, elementary levels of education, for if we as adults cannot accept differences among individuals, how can we expect our youth to convey this into the community when they, in turn, grow up?
Mr. Kunjufu, you seem to want to answer that question.
Yes. We have a curriculum titled SETCLAE, S-E-T-C-L-A-E, stands for Self-Esteem Through Culture, Leads to Academic Excellence. It's a comprehensive curriculum with textbooks and supplementary books and lesson plans and worksheets and posters, awards, videos, and a consultant. So I agree with the caller that we need to begin to teach children at a very early age in the elementary and high school level from a multicultural perspective, and we can reduce some of the problems we're seeing on college campuses.
We've got a question here in the audience.
Actually, I don't have one question. I have spent a great deal of my time in the past year or so, having come out of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore City, with most recently a master's degree, and having spent and been exposed to black college environment, Morgan State University in Baltimore. I do feel qualified to speak to the issues that have been raised here. What I see is basically what Shakespeare once alluded to. He said that the whole world is a stage and everybody's playing a part. And what I see is that various people are adopting various parts here and they're playing them. What we have here is an unfolding of biblical events. And in solving the entire problem-solving process, you do not grab a solution by fixating on a negative. And that's all I hear as I sit here, a constant stream of negatives being paraded forth for our scrutiny and our inspection. If you want to make progress, you look at the positives. We should not sit here and act amazed that on a college campus there's racism, when in fact, if we look at the elementary schools, we see evidence of taught hatred every day. So don't sit back and be amazed that people have, in fact, incorporated these hatred, feelings of hatred, and taken them into the collegiate environment when in fact they've been carefully groomed. Why pretend?
Thank you very much. We've got a call on the air from the University of Illinois. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Hello. This is Antoinette Kelly calling from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. What role can the university hierarchy, the administration, president, trustees, etc., play in abolishing racially insensitive mascots, logos, symbols, separatism, etc.?
Mr. Davis, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, and related to that, I think the administration has a key role to play in solving this issue. But just on the question of separatism, I think we've only looked at one side. I attended a predominantly white campus in Ohio, and I've been through this. In fact, I lived in an African heritage house, was our setup. I think, first of all, these are support systems. And the available evidence shows that on predominantly white campuses in particular, these support systems are absolutely necessary to ensure black student persistence to graduation, which is something else we haven't talked about. We've talked about black students getting into the university. We haven't talked about them remaining there, and we haven't talked about them graduating. The other thing I want to say is, having been in that environment, we're not looking at the other side. We had about 300 students on a campus of 3,000. So that meant that everywhere we went, all during the entire day, we were in a Eurocentric, predominantly white environment. Very few of us in classrooms, lots of other institutions for majority students, French house, German house, fraternity setup. The only time we had to get together for togetherness and brotherhood and sisterhood was when we came together in our African heritage house. So there's another side. That so-called separatism is just a small microcosm of a whole campus community.
Dr. Akbar, let me ask you this question. What do minority students miss if they separate themselves from the rest of the student body?
Oh, actually, they miss nothing, because most, as he just said, most, you see, I think that it's a moot argument to say that a lot is being missed because we don't choose to eat a particular meal with the mass of students. 90%, 80%, I don't know the mathematical accuracy, but a significant amount of one's time is spent interacting with the Euro-American community. Most of the professors are European Americans, most of the students, the classroom, the library, the media center, the computer center, every place you go, the plays, the theater, the creative, everything that's going on is essentially interacting with the wider student population. If I choose to sleep in a bedroom that has a face next to me that looks like me, what could I be missing in my sleep? If I choose to sit down and eat with people who want to eat and talk the way I choose to eat in an animated talking way, what could I be missing by not sitting in another corner of the room? So I think this is an overstated point. I think the concern is that whenever you African Americans choose to be with each other, to define their own direction for themselves, to define who they are, where they're going, everyone says they're militants, they're radicals, they're reverse racists, and that is absolutely absurd.
Susan Schneider, how does this apply across racial lines? What about Jewish students who may prefer to be with themselves because of a commonality of religion? Are there parallels here?
Well, I think the most striking parallel has to do with the issue of self-esteem, which basically we have all touched on in one form or another. That when we are talking about what it feels like to be a minority student, which Jewish students are as well, where the culture has defined certain standards that do not feel comfortable as your own, there is obviously a diminution in self-esteem, and you can feel more yourself when you are perhaps with people who are like yourself. But there's another aspect here that I would like to to throw open, which is that I think we have a great deal to learn from one another's pain, and that has to do with the issue of diversity rather than separatism. The separatism, I think, does serve a tremendously important function, similarly to the way women's groups serve an important function, even all women's colleges, it might be argued. But I think as well that we have to make opportunities to understand one another and to experience, as one Hasidic rabbi once said to his student, how can you claim to love me when you don't know what hurts me? It's very important that we have opportunities that aren't foreclosed by that separatism to talk about our personal feelings of exclusion, to find not only respect for each other's differences, but also the ways that we can work together on whatever is a shared agenda.
We've got a call from Miami-Dade Junior College. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Good afternoon. This is Fran Hogan calling from the Teleconference Center at North Campus of Miami-Dade Community College. As a member of a plural society, I would like to ask Dr. Kanjufu, what positive attitudes can we, quote, minorities, unquote, take not to be guilty of racism ourselves?
Of racism
Not to be
ourselves?
guilty of racism ourselves. How can we protect against what's called reverse racism?
Don't worry about it. Well, the only thing I want to say connected to that is that it's unfortunate. Some of our people are associating that when our students do well, you're acting white. And that's really unfortunate that our students tease each other and associate that with acting white, or speaking proper English is acting white. And that's why I think culture, again, is so important. When I was at Illinois State, I was black when I was on the track team, but I was an Oreo and a nerd when I was on the debate team. Then that was the black peer group that had begun to categorize those things that are for you and those things that are not for you. And unfortunately, we have to make sure that we don't do that to each other. The reason why Asians are doing so well in America is because they use their culture to inspire them. And it used to be before 1954, you used to tell black children, boy, girl, because the country's racist, you got to score more than 80, 90, or 100. You got to be the best. You got to score 110. Now, today's youth, some of them are using racism as a sign of insecurity, and we're now lowering the standards. We can't afford to do that.
Dr. Ehrlich, a connected but sort of different kind of slant on this question. How do you tell when a group on a college campus is racist? How do you tell when this is a hate group if it isn't obvious, if it doesn't wear white sheets and pointed hats?
Well, in fact, most groups don't wear white sheets and pointed hats, and there is only a limited number of organized right-wing racist groups on the college campus. And you tell simply by going around and observing on campus and understanding that the distribution of attitudes in this society is essentially racist, and that sometimes I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how is it that any white person growing up in the society has managed to escape racism and prejudice?
We've got a question here in the audience from a future college student.
Okay, everybody, y'all talking about self-esteem and stuff like that. The question is racism, and he said pointed hat and sheets. They don't have to wear pointed hat and sheets. Everybody in here has a little racism in their blood somehow. Like maybe I might not like somebody in my classroom. Is that racism? Yeah, that's a little bit of racism. Y'all can't just dispute one color of another color just because they don't like something.
How do we overcome that kind of thing, Dr. Akbar?
Well, Naeem, let me in on this. Right quick, see, Naeem and I are friends, so I can do that to him. That's that. And I'll be right back, Naeem. The distinction between prejudice and racism. See, there's this assumption that black people can be racist, and I disagree with that argument. Granted, young man, there are a lot of us that are prejudiced. There are dislikes that we have for each other. But to be racist is to be able to execute your prejudice through institutions, that you have the ability to hire and fire and control the means of production. And very few African Americans have the ability to do that. And we have to make a distinction then between prejudice and racism.
Mr. Rubenstein, you wanted to jump in here, I think.
I want to just second the comment made. There's been a lot of talk so far about attitudes and prejudice, and I think there are things you can do on college campuses and off to deal with prejudicial attitudes. For example, there's sensitivity training of various kinds that we know about. We're doing some at George Mason University. But that doesn't get you really too far, since those attitudes are symptomatic. They're symptomatic of a system that's not working, and that hasn't worked for a very long time, in some ways since its inception. So what we're finding in conflict resolution studies is two things that are germane to this discussion. One is that people have basic human needs, which, if they're not satisfied, are going to produce conflict. And identity is a basic human need. The people will separate to the extent that they need to separate to affirm their own identity. And there's hardly any use arguing about it, because it's a fact. They will do that. They're doing it all over the world, and they'll do it here, and they'll do it on college campuses, too, no matter what anybody says. The costs of trying to stop people from affirming their own identity are so high that it's not worth running them. At the same time, I think it also has to be said that people in conflict don't resolve the conflict, not really, until they realize that it's the same system which is generating the causes that have trapped them both, that have trapped all parties in the conflict. And that kind of realization comes through extremely honest and open discussion, analysis, in a protected environment, which is something that universities really are not supplying at the moment. For example, behind the stereotypes of black rapists and black criminals, there is a fact that many whites and many blacks are being essentially forced into crime. That the drug business in major cities has done what the government promised to do years ago and never did. It put billions
Dr.
of dollars.
Wallace, if you're still on the line representing the University of North Carolina, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
What does the university do to avoid, if it does anything at all, the kind of separatism we saw in the tape piece?
Well, let me just say on the matter of living arrangements, if you carefully look at the housing patterns on South Campus, you'll find that the majority of the students living there are white, and the largest percentage of black students that live on campus happen to live there as well. So in one sense, you can see that as one of the most integrated sections of our campus, because whites are still in the majority, but there are a large number of blacks living there. But recognizing that there is a desire to have students live on all parts of the campus, we have developed a number of outreach programs where we bring potential students to the campus, and we house them on North Campus to give them an introduction to that part of the campus and that living arrangement, hoping that that will at least give them another option. But at the same time, we are unwilling to arbitrarily decide that black and white students will live a certain place based on race. So at the same time, we try to recognize that freedom of decision. We also give them an introduction to the north part of the campus.
Mr. Williams, let me ask you a general kind of question. If the University of North Carolina refuses to assign students on the basis of race and they voluntarily segregate and separate themselves, are they or is the university guilty of violating any law?
Well, surely the students are not guilty of any violation of any federal law, and the university is not either. The university is providing access and choices for students to live in a fashion that they feel comfortable with.
Ms. Ashley, should the university take steps to avoid this kind of self-segregation?
Well, I kind of agree with Akbar in terms of I think that who you choose to sleep next to and who you choose to eat with is your own business. But on the other hand, I think the university can structure a lot of other more important interactions than those to promote some kind of understanding from between people. The thing that I would like to point to, though, there was a question we haven't addressed at all in our conversation, and that was what can higher administrations do? And before they get some training around sensitivity, they'd better watch essentially what they do, because most boards, most higher executives are not very sensitized themselves. Most of them in predominantly white institutions are white. Most of them, in fact, are not answering many of the questions we're raising today very well. And so that indicates, I think, a real need to confront these issues themselves before they become the spokespersons for their institutions or the real leadership on these issues.
Dr. Ashley, thank you for that, and thank you, Dr. Wallace, for joining us on the phone. Diversity is a widely used term today that symbolizes the ideal of persons from different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds working and learning together. The University of California of Berkeley, by all accounts, has gone further in this direction than any other major university in America. Berkeley is the flagship university of the UC system. It's considered to be one of the finest research institutions in the country. With a rich tradition in student activism, Berkeley has long been known as a progressive institution. Today, students of color comprise 65% of the Berkeley freshman class.
There has been an increasing sense of racial tensions. Sometimes I am scared.
This begins to affect your psyche, your academic performance.
There's no way that the college campus can be spared.
The undergraduate student body is very diverse, and I feel very comfortable because it is diverse.
If you just look around, just take a glance, you see all sorts of different people.
The one positive effect of the diversity is that it provides an opportunity for various students from different backgrounds, different racial and ethnic groups to be able to interact with one another.
The diversifying of the student body reflects the shifting social demographics in the state of California. But how has this extremely diverse student body affected everyday life at Berkeley?
I don't think that the university does anything really to help students understand the diversity. It's almost a situation where they say, this is the diversity level that we have, isn't it wonderful? Okay, now everybody interact.
We've not achieved nirvana. Students come largely from segregated communities, even in California. And just because we put them all in one place doesn't mean that we're going to immediately achieve a new social reality.
As a matter of fact, the strong presence of many ethnic and racial groups on campus has brought tension.
It's very hard for me, as someone who's supposed to be concerned at the helm, as it were, on this, to find ways to use very limited resources and increasingly limited resources to adjust to all the particular problems we have with this new diversity.
There are many prevalent myths that racial and ethnic minorities have to deal with. No group is immune to this.
The most is this foreignness that we seem to have, this air of foreignness or mysteriousness, a fascination that many non-Native people, especially white liberals, have with Native people and Native cultures, which is a large barrier in succeeding here.
Affirmative action plays a role in the diversification process by bringing qualified students of color into the university system, but it also stigmatizes them as being academically inferior. This can hurt their chances for success.
Many people are under the impression that we're all here because we're some kind of welfare case, and we are filling in spots where there are several hundred disenfranchised white people out there who should have been in UC.
There is a tendency to identify people of color with special action admits. They're shunted aside, they're considered not important, they're considered to be lazy, they're considered to be not intelligent, and consequently, they are marginalized at this institution.
It is clear that the administration faces many challenges in the quest for true diversity. University Chancellor Chang-Lin Tien has set a number of goals to meet these challenges.
First and perhaps foremost is, of course, academic and faculty excellence. However, the second goal I mentioned is the diversity. And I particularly stress the term excellence through diversity.
I believe over the last 10 years that excellence has been sacrificed on the altar of diversity. And then now Tien comes in and uses a rhetorical trick that sounds nice, but I mean, it doesn't, I mean, in practicality, either you make allowances for minorities and lower the standards so they increase their numbers, or you don't.
The standards here have not dropped, and indeed over time, the academic profile of the student body here has increased in the last few years.
The profile of students has been changing towards one of diversity, yet these students of color who are searching for their own identity still face a faculty and a curriculum which represents a foreign, often hostile white culture.
There is a problem on this campus of diversifying the faculty. You know, the state of California is going to be changing in demographics by the year 2000. We have to keep up with this if this is going to be a public institution. I don't see the University of California doing that at all.
The curriculum is still very Eurocentric, and the faculty is still very white, male-dominated.
Diversity in teaching does demand the recruiting of professors of color. It also requires giving them a fair shot at tenure, a situation that may not exist for professors such as Joel Garcia.
Mine was one case and among a number of cases
within the University of California system of how people of color who are faculty members and women are actually put to a higher standard than other faculty. They have greater demands put upon them in many different ways. Their interests are generally underappreciated and sometimes invalidated altogether. And then when it comes to evaluation, we are expected to, I think, perform miracles before we're considered acceptable as part of the community of scholars.
The model of diversity should provide for an enriching educational experience for all cultures and ethnicities. However, students, faculty, and administrators alike must realize there is more to diversity than having a racially representative student population. They must also prepare for the inevitability that diversifying the student body will lead to racial tension.
It would be mindless to think you could have this kind of social transformation without social pain. If there's an injustice in the world, and it's been there for a long time, and you try to wrench and redress that injustice, some groups are going to be experiencing pain.
I'd rather have this problem now than the problem of the lack of any of these students in 1970. You understand? I don't enjoy all the trouble, but I sure enjoy having these problems rather than the problems of nobody around, nobody going on, you know, into higher education and on into careers. I'd much rather have this problem.
Joining me live on the telephone line is Andre Bell, Director of Admissions at Berkeley. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Bell.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Once again, I want to remind our viewers that at this time, please call in with your questions and comments on diversity. The telephone number is 1-800-344-2388. If you have other questions, we'll try to take them at the end of today's program. I think we've got a caller on the line. You're on the air, caller.
Yes, this is Jenna Campbell, Columbia University Teachers College site. We've addressed institutional, group, and individual responsibility for racist behavior on campuses. But what is the federal government's responsibility to support positive initiatives and gains as they relate to race on campus? I'd like to Mr. Williams to respond, especially in light of recent threats to scholarships and programming for students of color.
Mr. Williams?
Well, the first responsibility as it relates to, let's say, incidents of hate violence or racial harassment on campuses, our responsibility, particularly in the Office for Civil Rights, is to investigate those matters when they're brought to our attention and to use our own initiative to identify situations that might be prevalent, might be occurring on college campuses around the country. It is our responsibility, number one, to advise colleges and universities about what their responsibilities are to create an environment and to maintain an environment that is conducive to learning on their campuses. And that's something that the Office of Civil Rights is working with right now as we speak, so that we can provide that kind of guidance to colleges and universities, so that we can provide that same kind of guidance to our investigators out in the field. As it also relates in terms of what our responsibility is, it's our responsibility to do honest and thorough investigations as it relates to those kinds of complaints that are provided to us. We probably need to keep in mind that the Office for Civil Rights is a law enforcement agency, and as a result, that's what it does. It investigates allegations of violations. As it relates to the issue of scholarships, we might as well discuss it a little bit, and we spent some hour and a half of not doing it. But I think what we need to keep in mind, particularly as it relates to the issue of diversity, quite honestly, colleges do indeed have a real responsibility to bring a whole host of students onto their campuses and to bring on the students on their campuses that reflect a diverse population. The question is not whether we value diversity, the question is how do we get there? And as we look at some of the things that colleges and universities are doing, it is all right, and it's deeply encouraged when you bring students on your campus to do so in a way that looks at a whole host of criteria, in addition to grades and things of that nature, to determine who might be a successful student, who might thereby leave from your college and university, go on to be successful in the workforce and go on being successful in the society. But there is a real concern, as it is raised in current law. It is not something that we in the Office of Civil Rights have the authority to sort of break out of whole cloth. But the current law recognizes that there are ways in which diversity can be achieved. And one of that, quite honestly, you can achieve diversity by bringing in people who have been discriminated against in the past. That is something that's recognized in the law. And it is recognized in the law that there are other things that you can do that are conscious of race in order to achieve diversity. But what the law does not allow us to do is to say that the only kind of diversity we want is racial diversity. We have a former Supreme Court case that says that what you want in terms of diversity is a host of different kinds of characteristics. You want people of a variety of racial backgrounds. You want people of a variety of economic backgrounds. You want people of a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, and that's diversity. But the courts have not told us that racial diversity is the only kind of diversity we can achieve, while many of us may want to be able to say that.
Mr. Williams, we got another caller on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my call. I'm calling from Cal Poly Pomona, and we're in the process of establishing a multicultural center. However, we have two questions that we're trying to answer before we establish this center. One is, should the center be part of the existing student union, and or should it be a separate building by itself? And what are the pros and cons about that? And the second question is, what type of programs should the center offer so that it does not exclude any group on the campus, on campus university?
Dr. Ashley, do you have an answer to that caller's concerns? Ought it be part of the building, not part of the building, part of the general mainstream? I think the point of the question was, where ought it be?
I think that's something the individual campus community has to decide, whether the traffic patterns are such. I would never vote for putting a multicultural center on the perimeter of the campus or across the street so that it's so isolated. On the other hand, I think that really is a community question. The ties about what you do in a multicultural center ought to be discussed broadly across that entire community, not just students, but students and faculty and staff, so that the library's connected, so that the coursework is connected, so that there's a way to run white students through the center. And that's critical. And how you answer those questions, if you don't really have meaningful discussions, I think that what will happen to that center is the same as what happened to many of them. It started in the 70s and died.
Andre Bell from Berkeley, do you have a response?
Well, I think it's clear here on the Berkeley campus, our approach is to do a joint approach with multiculturalism as a centerpiece, but recognizing, as many of the panelists have already indicated, there is virtue in unique ethnic clusters and strengths that the groups then gather to bring to this multicultural table.
Thank you for that. We've got a comment and a question from an audience member.
Right. First of all, the comments. On the subject of diversity, I think a simple statement can sum that up by saying you either walk towards life or you walk towards death. Now, at the beginning of this conference, when we look at the title, Dealing with Racism, Causes and Solutions, we have not even really defined the true context of racism. And I'd like to do that and then throw some information out to the panel to deal with that. First of all, when you look at racism, I think Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and also Dr. Neely Fuller summed it up best when they define racism as white supremacy. We have to realize that there are 9 areas of people activity that exist in the world. One of those is education. When we look at education under the proper context with a proper frame of reference of white supremacy, education equals castration, education equals brainwashing, mutilation, and indoctrination. It does not equal enlightenment. Now, my question is simply this. Are we going to spend the rest of our time here dealing with coping mechanisms, or are we going to spend our time here dealing with the alleviation of the power structure that is not allowing us to reach our full potential? Are we going to spend the rest of our time here dealing with fantasy or reality? My questions to the panel. First of all, who founded this system? How is it maintained, and how will it be destroyed? We have.
I'm sorry, we can only let one question go at a time. Before any member of the panel answers the question, we'll get an answer. Before we get an answer from a panel member, I ought to remind both the panel members, the studio audience, and the audience viewing us over television that there is a section of this program which is going to be devoted to solutions. from the panel members and from as many people as we can include. So we ought not think that solutions aren't included. Any member of the panel want to respond? Yes.
If Juanes will let me do so this time. Let me try to bring in several issues. I think that the brother's question was just raised, as well as the whole issue of diversity. I think we have to be very, very careful, because once we begin to get caught up in the new speak phenomena, whereby words begin to mean everything and start meaning nothing. And I think that one of the dangers we've already run into is the issue, for an example, of having black issues, African American issues, reduced into minority issues. And we are now equating issues affecting women with issues affecting minorities. And women are not minorities by any stretch of the imagination in this society. But therefore, funding and other kinds of programmatic solutions have tried to encompass both of them as if they were the same thing. This issue of diversity has brought in a definition of like homosexuals, females, athletes, anyone who isn't fitting the mainstream pattern of male, Euro-American, Caucasians, heterosexuals of European descent is therefore a part of that diversity. Now what that does is that's a trick, I think, to keep us away from the real issue. The issue that we are dealing with when we talk about racism, as he said very clearly, is the historical treatment of people of color in this society. That's where the push came from. That was the urgency that must be dealt with. That is the group that has not received any kind of reparative treatment. That is the group that has been historically always ends up at the bottom regardless of what kind of implementation is there. That's the group that no matter what they've done on the surface has always ended up rising to the top again. And therefore, we need to address that specific issue. And I think it can only be done by beginning to be clear and correct in terms of our definitions. And I think the definition must be is that when we talk about racism, 9 times out of 10, we are talking about the historical treatment of people of color by people of non-color. And I think that's the outcome.
We've got a caller on the line from Oklahoma. Go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, my name is Ron Johnson. I'm at the University of Oklahoma. I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission. My question is directed to Dr. Conjufo as it relates directly to the African American as an endangered species and how that interrelates with the racism that exists throughout the country on college campuses. If you could respond to that, please.
Well, as you know, unfortunately, in the book Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys at Birth, there are 1.03 black boys born in the world to 1.0 black girls. 18 years later, now 1.0 available black men to 1.8 available black women. There's a rumor that by the year 2000, 70% of all black males will be unavailable to black women. While we have this workshop or this teleconference, there are 609,000 African American men involved in the penal institution and only 430,000 African American men involved in college. 47% of the prison population is made up of black males. Only 3.5% of college students are black males. The educational president allocates $2,300 to send someone to Head Start. He allocates $18,000 to $30,000, the same person, to prison. Knowing 85% of the inmates that are released go right back in. So as Jesse Jackson says, you have 2 choices. You can either send me to Penn State or to State Penn. Reagan and Bush chose to cut Head Start Chapter 1 of Belgium.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here in the audience. What's your question or comment, please?
Right. I think that when we deal with the issue of diversity, we first have to deal with the issue of financial access. So if people can't afford the education in the U.S. where it is treated as a commodity, they obviously can't receive it. So we have to look at the situation with diversity where you have a situation in the U.S. where African Americans are 13% of the population, 8.6% of the college-age population enrolled in school, and 40% of the U.S. Army. So we have to also look at the poverty draft. So my question is related to, again, going back to Mr. Williams, does the U.S. government treat education as a right, as a civil right, especially for people of color in this country where they cannot afford it? And with the issue with the threats to scholarships for students of color, will the courts be dealing with the issue of educational rights as a civil right?
Mr. Williams?
Well, as a matter of constitutional law, no, the courts have not said that education is a right that's protected by the Constitution. But in terms of what the department's approach is, if you've had an opportunity to witness the confirmation hearing of the upcoming secretary, the secretary said that what he wants most is for disadvantaged students and minority students to be in college and not out of college. The question is, how do we get there?
Well, as long as we spend 50 to 57 cents of every dollar on the war and military, and only 2 cents on education, we're not going to achieve any serious change.
Howard. Thank you a great deal. Thank you. Now it's a time to look at some solutions. It's important that students, faculty, and administrators take measures in combating campus racism. First, we must all face the reality that racism exists in higher education today and on your campus. Now we'll talk about some specific suggestions for student solutions. Make overt efforts to plan social and academic interaction between students of different ethnicities. Don't ostracize, criticize, or alienate students from your own race who choose to have meaningful contacts and relations with other students. Become active in the affairs of your campus, including student government, academic organizations, and social groups. Demand accountability from your student leaders in terms of fostering positive race relations on your campus. Take care to ensure that the staff of all student publications are thoroughly apprised of the highly sensitive nature of their positions. Let's see if our panel has something to add. Dr. Ashley?
I think I would add that you need to start the minute that students hit your campus, and you need to instill in them the values that you have around diversity, and that's one thing that we've started at the University of Cincinnati. In our orientation program, we have a mandatory diversity session, which all students must attend, in which they learn the expectations of the institution. And then you have to keep that going. You have to keep it going maybe in orientation to college classes that you institute, in open forums that you plan for discussion, in publications that you provide for all students of the multicultural resources on that campus.
Any other member of the panel care? Dr. Rose?
I think that one of the things that we have to continue to remember is that racism does manifest itself in its very unique way. But that once we get into that ethnocentrism that says that our oppression is different, therefore someone else's oppression is not our problem, that we get very narrow and we will end up creating enemies when we really should be building allies. Everyone's oppression, the oppression of Jews, the oppression of gay lesbian people, all oppressions are our oppressions, and I think we have to approach it in that way.
Ray Davis?
I think with SCAR's experience, what we have to have at a minimum is a two-tiered approach. On the one hand, you have to have a multiracial coalition of students on the campus, faculty and staff, that want to push the institution in a progressive manner. The other hand, you have to have serious codes of conduct, which we have talked about a little bit, that will eliminate the overt racial acts and make it clear that those acts will not be tolerated on the campus. Neither of those will work, however, without a strong institutional commitment. And I think that's coming clear in what we're hearing. It was clear in the UNC example. Without the institution behind this, it's not going anywhere.
Dr. Clark?
It seems to me that Dr. Rose, Roybo Rose, makes a very important point here. The fact is that in various kinds of ways, women have been oppressed and are still being oppressed. In fact, I would venture to say that there are more women being killed by the power structure literally today than there are blacks and other minorities. I don't want to get into an issue of comparing oppression, but I do think it's important to recognize that each of these groups has a history, and some of that history for many of them has been problematic. Let me say specifically with regard to responses to this problem, I would encourage us to truly focus on utilizing multicultural and gender fair curricula, similar to what we've set up at Cal State Fullerton with an ethnic studies component where each person is able to take an intercultural socialization experience and learn from that.
Dr. Clark, I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but time constraints are pushing us forward.
Sure.
We want to take a look now at the specific role of the faculty, exactly what Dr. Clark was mentioning, in improving the racial environment on their campuses. They can make sure that the curricula in their department is inclusive of the contributions of various ethnic groups. They can identify, encourage, and mentor minority students to pursue careers in college teaching and administration. They can become familiar with the minority caucuses and other subgroups within their academic discipline. And they can demand accountability from their chair, their dean, their provost, and their president for support in multicultural teaching and research efforts. They can take the initiative to ensure that their departments include issues of the eradication of racism and the promotion of diversity in all of its practices and policies. And they can include issues of diversity as standard areas of inquiry in all employment decisions. Dr. Clark, let me come back to you because you were talking precisely about this subject a little bit more quickly about this curriculum.
Okay, well, the multicultural curriculum that I'm talking about would recognize and appreciate the specific histories of women, of blacks, of Asian Americans, of Latinos, of Middle Easterners in these days. The reality is that you do find a certain amount of prejudice, ethnocentrism, and indeed discrimination being heaped toward these other groups by and between blacks and these other groups as well. And I do think we need to acknowledge and deal with that issue on college campuses.
Any other member of the panel? Yes, Mr. Ehrlich?
I think the suggestions you made are all well taken, but they won't work. And they won't work without changing the distribution of rewards and the structure of the university itself. Faculty are not rewarded for participating in the internal affairs of the university. They're rewarded for participating in their professional associations through publication. And
Dr. Ehrlich, that leads naturally into our next segment. We want to look at some suggestions for campus administrators in dealing with racial issues. In conjunction with the Board of Trustees, they can form presidential-level standing committees on institutional diversity with authority to draft university-wide policies and procedures. In conjunction with legal counsel and/or campus lawyers, draft definitive ethno-violence harassment policies for all factions of the university. They can communicate widely and regularly institutional policy on penalties for violators. They can act swiftly and definitively when acts of ethno-violence and harassment occur. They can encourage support for diversity efforts through funding and other resource allocations to those areas that demonstrate leadership, and demand accountability from departments either through the diversity of their faculties or the matriculation rates of minority students in the discipline. And they can convene regularly scheduled campus activities around the promotion of diversity. Make certain that race relations training be required for all persons employed as campus police. Mr. Ehrlich, I cut you off because you were just getting ready to talk about this subject, administration, rewards, and I dare say punishments.
We have a fundamental paradox. We are attempting to promote diversity and equality in an institutional structure that is essentially hierarchical and authoritarian. And unless we make our battle that of an anti-authoritarian battle, all of this work will have no payoff. We need to restructure fully the university, if not the entire society, along egalitarian lines in every sector.
Richard Rubenstein?
I agree entirely, and to make it even plainer, you asked before about what the obligation of faculty members is. The obligation of faculty is to teach students what they need to know, and not necessarily what the faculty member thinks is his or her right to teach because of his or her exalted status. We are not only not rewarded for participating in university affairs, faculty are also not rewarded for teaching. They are not rewarded, for example, for recognizing that a student that comes from an educational background may need a little help in writing. And to give up temporarily one's advanced research and one's exalted concerns long enough to actually work with somebody on their writing is something that's very rare, and it's not rewarded. The other thing I wanted to say, Julian, is that from an administration, when you ask what the administration should do, there's no question that as diversity increases, conflict is probably going to increase. And so at George Mason University, and I'm sure at other schools too, we're trying to implement a three-prong program, of which one prong involves bringing the groups that we are pretty sure are going to get into conflict now into continuous dialogue, and providing them with a protected environment where they can talk to each other and find out what's on each other's minds. Very important, I think, in that respect, to recognize that calling somebody a racist, even though he or she is a racist, is not necessarily either going to change them or give you an answer to the question, where is the racism coming from? What in the system is producing this racism? So it's important, I think, aside from codes of conduct, that we create an atmosphere on university campuses, at least in some places, that permits people to let it hang out, to be honest with each other, and not to fear that they're going to be branded this, that, or the other thing, because without that evidence of what they're thinking, we can't say where in the society that's coming from, and we can't change the system.
We've got a question on the line now that's pertinent to this issue. Go ahead, caller.
Some faculties still cause racial tension. What are ways that might reduce the change negative attitudes of faculty besides sensitivity workshops?
Question, if you didn't hear, what are ways that you might change negative faculty images if faculties are responsible for racial tension on the campus? Dr. Akbar?
Well, you know, I think that this paradox of authoritarian versus rights addresses that issue. That is that at the same time that I think we certainly have to always respect individual rights and the right of the individual to make certain choices, we've also learned historically in this country that there is no way to effectively address the issues of racism unless there is some type of authority overhead that says this is unacceptable. It is only when it has been legislated, demanded, and people in authority establish some criteria for conduct. So my concern is that we can't begin to change faculty unless we begin to change the authority structure which will permit that to happen. The concern I have is that even with the more liberal policy, as Dr. Ehrlich suggested, whereby faculty are making decisions, I'm not sure these issues will be resolved either. So I think that it's going to become necessary to bring the kind of pressure from the top of the existing authority makers to say that these kinds of standards must be observed if this is going to be an effective institution.
Any other member of the panel wanted to speak to this question? Yes, Dr. Ashley.
I'd like to say just a couple of additional things. I think one way we get at more egalitarian institutions is that we've got to have discussions across levels, and we've got to start kind of stop separating ourselves into students' responsibility, faculty responsibility, and administrative responsibility. The second thing I would like to say is that I think we've got to jointly, strategically plan to change our institutions, and then we've got to, as an administration, support and fund interdisciplinary innovative notions. We've got to find the money. We would find it for a telephone system, and this is infinitely more important.
Here's a question for any member of the panel. A lot of minority students, black students particularly, seek black colleges as a refuge from the kind of racism they may run into at a majority white campus. Is that the answer to this problem? Anyone, Dr. Clark?
Not ultimately, because obviously half the black students who go to college go to white colleges. Black colleges do have some burdens in terms of size and resources, et cetera. We are going to have to deal with white institutions and ultimately with white businesses and corporations when we're out of college. I think it is important to underscore the awareness training approach for our administrators and people on our boards of trustees as an initial way of sensitizing them to the possibility of restructuring their programs into more partnership models.
We've got a caller from Utica College in Syracuse, New York, and before that caller speaks, I want to thank all of the people who called, those who did manage to get through and those who didn't. Go ahead, Utica College, go ahead.
Okay, where do African American students turn to on predominantly white campuses for help in dealing with racial problems if the administration only reacts to this problem if a large incident occurs?
Where does a student turn to on a majority white campus, a minority student, if the administration only reacts when an incident occurs? Mr. Davis, you're the student.
Well, as I've said before, if there are faculty mentors that you feel comfortable with, you could go to them. There may be situations, I don't know if you have a community program whereby you go off campus, maybe you have a church program. If you're with community people on Sunday, it would also be good if you can find allies in that way. And of course, if there is an Office of Minority Affairs or a Black Studies or an African Studies program. Any of those places would be places that you should initially go for support. And if you can't find it there, then begin to assess what you have as alternatives.
Dr. Ashley?
I would just like to encourage students of color to not give up on all of us who may be labeled as part of the institution, and try to at least bring some of that to our attention so that those of us who have been in these institutions trying to push them from a variety of places can continue to do so on your behalf.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashley. Before we close this program, we'd like to give you some hotline telephone numbers to report racially motivated incidents. You can call the United States Department of Justice hotline at 1-800 1-347-HATE. The National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence at 1-301-328-5170. The National Organization for Victim Assistance at 1-202-232-6682, and the National Victim Center at 1-817-877-3355. I'd like to thank our panelists, our studio audience, and our viewing audience for their questions and their comments. We hope that we've contributed to your ability to understand and to solve the problems of campus racism at your university. We also hope that we've given you the foundation to move toward meaningful diversity and the achievement of a campus climate that optimizes each person's ability to excel. Thank you for joining us. For Black Issues in Higher Education, I'm Julian Bond. This program was broadcast from the studios of Black Entertainment Television. On March 13th, we tangle with the silent killer and present AIDS, Impact on College Campuses. Take part in the fact-filled discussion on education, behavior modification, and prevention.
Hotel accommodations for guests appearing in this program provided by the Washington Hilton and Towers in Washington, D.C. The Washington Hilton is the official meeting headquarters for such prestigious organizations as the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, Blacks in Government, Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and National Black Child Development Institute. When in Washington, D.C., plan to visit the beautiful Washington Hilton and Towers.
This has been a Cox, Matthews & Associates Incorporated television production.